I'm honored to be here today with two distinguished guests. Both are senior fellows with the Geotech Center here at the Atlantic Council, and they have impressive backgrounds to speak on what data trusts are. We have Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who is the Liberal Democrat digital spokesperson for the House of Lords. He has also played a role as the chair for the Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence and other parliamentary activities in the United Kingdom. We're also joined by Dame Wendy Hall, who is the professor of computer science and the pro-vice chancellor and the executive director for the Web Science Institution at the University of Southampton. Dame Wendy, could you actually help for our audience what we might need to be thinking about in terms of what data trusts are and why they matter?
In 2017, which seems like a universe ago now, I was asked by the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, to co-chair a report for the UK government on AI and how to use AI to help grow the economy, which, boy, are we going to need coming out of this. And as part of this, we did a lot of consultation with various groups, particularly with industry, because it was meant to be an industry-facing report. And the first thing the small companies particularly said to us was how hard it was to get hold of the data. And so we started to talk about this idea of data trust, which had existed before the report, and called that term means different things to different people, and the same idea can be called different things. But it's basically about how you set up any sort of data. Could be personal data, it could be data that's very confidential to a company, it could be linked to open data, but the idea is that you set up an agreement between the people that want to share data, a legal agreement with an ethical framework to describe how you're going to share the data and under what terms and conditions. And that is termed a data trust. That's what we called it in the review. That was our top recommendation, was that the UK should consider how to do this. And it occurred to me that this is now even more important than it was before, because we will have to globally be sharing really quite personal data in order to be able to travel around the world. And we need our governments globally to have access to data about who's had the virus, what symptoms, what treatment, what work, all these things. We are going to need various types of people, the medics, the data scientists, the statisticians, to pore over this data. And we have to do this in a global way. So we not only need data trusts in individual countries, we really need what we called on the AI Council that was set up last year, we called about transnational data trusts. We are going to need this mechanism.
With that, I'd now like to turn to Lord Tim. I was wondering if you could give your perspective both in terms of what possible legal frameworks there might be, and then given your perspective from Parliament, why is this something that government should care about? Why is this something that should be something that's done both by national governments, but ideally working with international partners as well?
In a sense, it cuts that real Gordian knot about private interest and public interest, because one of the big issues is what are the circumstances in which a public authority can use the data for a public valid purpose. And that's exactly what Wendy's talking about here. In a COVID-19 situation or another big public health situation, what are the rules of the game? How can we enshrine that in a way that gains public trust? And I think that's a really important concept. Now, of course, this has got huge application in current circumstances where people are concerned about some of the tracking and tracing apps, and in terms of just what data is being used, how long it's going to be used for. I mean, you've probably seen the quote from Yuval Noah Harari that, we're either going to have totalitarian surveillance or we're going to have, citizen participation. And that is going to be really one of the question marks for the future.
With the AI committee that you chaired, what were some of the possibilities that were being considered, recognizing the reports came out in 2017 and then obviously we're now in the pandemic, but what were some of the things that people were thinking about as sort of prototypical ways to start sort of moving forward with data trust to actually inform AI in a way that would involve the public as well?
The way we thought about it back in 2018 was actually quite apposite for now, which is a health purpose for a data trust, basically, where you had an entity like our National Health Service, which was able to have certain rules that applied to the data that it collected and shared and used, and then those rules applied to the companies and so on and so forth. What it doesn't always say is that an entity like the NHS has to be absolutely transparent about how it is using that data. And I think a data trust would make sure that they had to do that in those circumstances. And again, we're back to the issue of public trust, because if we don't get public trust, then all we do is breed suspicion. We don't get buy-in from the general public. People won't load apps voluntarily to their phones and so on. I mean, we've seen the tracing app that the Singaporean government used, and it was done on a voluntary basis, but only 1 in 6 people signed up to that. And I think that if we had a really decent structure, a recognized structure of data trusts with clearly established rules, that people would sign up. They'd have a greater faith that their data wasn't being misused.
Dame Wendy, from your perspective, what have you seen in terms of nascent efforts to move data trust forward?
I know there are several firms of lawyers in the UK who've been are on the verge of announcing that they've set up data trusts, and at the moment they are the lawyers are setting them up as using as contractual agreements. I mean, the key thing is that they to have to quote from the lawyers I was talking to yesterday, the trust needs to know what its purpose is. And it needs to have an ethical code of practice. Many lawyers I talk to say a contract, but you have to have a governance model. Who is actually going to judge whether the company, the organizations involved are abiding by the rules and regulations set down in the trust agreement?
My own experiences in responding to outbreaks, oftentimes when you try to centralize, you find that some hospitals, they were considering cases, they counted cases differently. Absolutely. Or they would report them only every 3 days. And so you'd see a spike every 3 days, but that was an artificiality in the data. So I like your principle about empowering the edge. On the data ethics question, real quick, before I also ask Lord Tim, were there any early examples of like a simple ethical principle to have? Like, could we update and say, do unto others as they give permission to have done with their data, or something like that for the 21st century? I mean,
of course, there are a number of organizations. I mean, Europe is awash with AI and ethics. This was another huge topic of conversation before the pandemic and will continue for many years afterwards. And actually, in some ways, timing-wise, it was good we had some of those conversations before the pandemic, because there are various organizations throughout the world that have put up ethical principles for AI. And I think we could adopt some of those for, there might need to be more detailed in terms of data sharing, because many of them were quite high-level ethical frameworks. But it seems actually this is, to me, the way to approach AI ethics, is to look at, because at the moment AI is about, AI is more than this, but at the moment AI is about machine learning, and that learning is done on data. And so if you look at the data ethics, then that really helps inform your AI ethics. And so that's where I'd start to look at the various treaties that have been put up about AI ethics, and then apply those in the concept of a trust.
Well said. And I've also found it interesting how everyone's rushed to AI ethics, recognizing AI is the new shiny. But if you don't think about the data ethics, it's exactly. Kind of like you don't have enough of a foundation to talk about AI. So Lord Tim, on your thoughts, what would you see as good principles or ethics to consider? Do you have anything to add?
There is a debate going on at this very moment about what kind of tracing apps are going to be adopted broadly across the UK. And, we have the decentralized model. There's an app, for instance, being developed by one of our universities called the Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing System, for instance, DP3T for short. But then the NHSX, if you like, the digital bit of the NHS, is developing a much more centralized app. And so there is a bit of a debate going on, exactly in the way that Wendy's talking about. And I think, exactly like she said, the default should be a decentralized system. And of course, when we talk about AI ethics, the whole issue is whether you can operationalize those principles, and whether you put them in regulation, in corporate governance standards, or in circumstances like this, where you actually want a set of rules that relate to the way you use data. I think we're all right in terms of talking about AI ethics, transparency, freedom from bias, public benefit, and so on. But I think we're going to have to go quite a bit further when we're talking about this kind of data collection, sharing, use at a time like this, because there are many, you've probably seen many articles saying, well, look, what we can't do is have a situation where this is a once for all. People collect our data. We're now in a state of surveillance, basically, and we're not going to be able to return to what most liberal democracies regard as being, our normal civil liberties.
Very well said. Not to put you on the spot, but let's say Google and Apple decided today to go to you and Dame Wendy and say, okay, we got it. We're on board with data trust. What would be the first step that you would recommend that they consider, or anybody consider, to mobilize data trust quickly to respond to the current COVID-19 crisis?
Well, the big problem would be that there is no off-the-shelf data trust at this moment. I mean, Wendy's quite rightly talked about the models that are kind of currently just about there. In the UK, I would go for the equivalent of a not-for-profit, basically. There are community interest companies which are clearly seen to be for public benefit. That's their constitution. It's the way they're constituted. And I suspect that the opposite, their opposite number in the States in terms of not-for-profit corporations would be the kind of model that one would go for. And then you would actually then have a set of rules, a set of ethics, as Wendy said, and then some more specific rules about engagement and so on. But the governance at the end of the day is the really tricky bit.
So let's say Google and Apple said they wanted to do data trust tomorrow. First, we would need to do is convene different stakeholders that have data set of value. It could be NHS, for example, in the UK. It could be private companies or other health companies that would have information that would be of use. And then try to figure out how we can work together in a way that is both transparent to what's being done, and then two, making sure we set aside self-interest of any of the individual participants and think about the good of the public. We need to start thinking about whatever we do, eventually having some auditing to make sure what's being done is consistent with the values instantiated. We need to also think about how we're transparent about the code of ethics that are being done. And then finally, we do need to think globally, and that we need to recognize that if we're waiting for things to show up on our shores or just in our own data in the middle of a pandemic, this is truly global in nature, and so we'll be at a disadvantage. And so we need to think about how we build this coalition globally.
I think you put your finger on it, David, broadly. The only thing I would say is that it's that first premise when you say Google and Apple come forward and say, we're going to set up a data trust. I think I would like to think of it more as, well, we would like to participate and help create a data trust. I think that would be probably a much more constructive way forward.
But I want to thank both Lord Tim and Dame Wendy for your amazing insights. This was truly a very engaging conversation.